Susan Miller worked as a nurse at Oak Ridge Veterans Hospital for 15 years. She loved her job and cared deeply for the sick veterans. Every day, she woke up at 5 in the morning, put on her blue uniform, and drove her old car to the hospital. The other nurses often told her to get more rest, but Susan always said the veterans needed her more than she needed sleep. The hospital sat on a green hill with a view of the city below. It was a large building with 6 floors and many long hallways. Susan knew every room and every corner. She knew which floor tiles made noise at night and which vending machine gave out extra snacks if you hit it just right. But most of all, she knew her patients. On the 3rd floor in room 3-12 lived Frank Winters. Frank had fought in the Vietnam War many years ago. The war left deep marks on his mind and body. His hair was now white, and his eyes looked tired. Frank did not talk much. Most days he sat by the window and watched birds in the trees. When nurses or doctors came to check on him, he only nodded or shook his head. Susan felt a special duty to help Frank. She noticed things about him that no one else did. She saw how his hands shook less when classical music played on the radio. She noticed he slept better when his blinds were half open to let in some moonlight. Small things, but they mattered. One Monday morning, Susan checked on Frank and saw his breakfast tray was full. The eggs and toast sat cold and untouched. "Not hungry today, Frank?" she asked. Frank looked at her briefly, then back out the window. Susan made a note in his file and moved on to her other patients. But when she returned later, his lunch was also untouched. This worried her. The next day was the same. Frank would not eat. On the 3rd day, Susan checked his records and saw he had not eaten anything for 3 full days. His body was getting weaker. "Frank," Susan said, sitting in the chair next to his bed, "you need to eat to keep your strength up." Frank turned to her. His voice was rough from not being used much. "The food here has no taste. Makes me think of army rations. Brings back bad memories." This was the most Frank had said it once in months. Susan nodded slowly, thinking. Hospital rules were very clear. No outside food was allowed for patients without special approval. All meals had to come from the hospital kitchen to make sure they were safe and followed each patient's diet plan. Breaking this rule could get a nurse in big trouble. Susan thought about it all night. The next morning she made chicken soup at home, her grandmother's recipe. She put it in a container and hid it in her big purse. At work she heated it in the staff break room microwave and brought it to Frank's room. "Try this," she said, placing the bowl on his table. "It's not from the kitchen." Frank looked at the soup. Steam rose from the bowl, carrying the smell of herbs and chicken. He took a small spoonful, then another. For the first time in days, he ate everything in his bowl. "Tastes like home," he said quietly when he finished. Susan smiled. "I'll bring more tomorrow." For 5 days, Susan brought homemade food for Frank. He started to look better. Color returned to his face and he began talking more. He told Susan about his hometown in Ohio, his dog when he was a boy, and even a little about his time in the war. Other nurses noticed the change in Frank but didn't know the reason. On the 6th day, the hospital director, George Simpson, called Susan to his office. He was a tall man with glasses who always wore a tie that was too tight. His desk was very clean with everything in perfect order. "Nurse Miller," he said without looking up from a file, "it has come to my attention that you have been bringing outside food to patient Frank Winters in room 312. Susan's heart beat faster. "Yes, sir. He wasn't eating the hospital food. He was getting weaker." "Did you request approval for special meals from the dietary department?" "No, sir. Frank needed help right away. I was worried about how fast he was losing weight." George Simpson closed the file and looked at Susan. "Rules exist for a reason, Nurse Miller. What if your food made him sick? What if he had an allergic reaction? The hospital could be sued." "But he's getting better," Susan said. "He's eating again, he's talking more. That's not the point. The point is that you broke a very important rule." He handed her a paper. "You are suspended for 2 weeks without pay, starting today. We will review your case and decide if you can keep your job." Susan felt like the floor was falling away under her feet. "But Frank needs me. All my patients need me. Other nurses will cover your patients. Please clean out your locker and leave the building. Susan walked down the hall in shock. 15 years of perfect work, and now she might lose her job because she gave soup to a man who would not eat. Tears filled her eyes as she opened her locker. News traveled fast in the hospital. By lunchtime, everyone knew about Susan's suspension. The other nurses were upset. Many veterans asked where Nurse Miller was. When told she was suspended, they demanded to know why. As Susan carried a small box of her things to the parking lot, she saw a group of veterans gathering in the hospital lobby. William Porter, an Army sergeant who lost his leg in Afghanistan, was talking loudly to anyone who would listen. "Nurse Miller saved my life when I first came here," he said. "I was in so much pain I wanted to die. She sat with me all night once, when I couldn't sleep. And they suspend her for helping someone eat? That's not right." Susan wanted to go back in and thank William, but she knew it would only cause more trouble. She put her box in her car and drove home, wondering if her career was over because she chose to be kind. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment looking at old photos of her nursing school graduation, her phone rang. It was Kelly from the front desk at the hospital. "Susan," Kelly whispered into the phone, "you won't believe who just walked into the hospital asking about you." "Who?" Susan asked. "Chuck Norris." Susan almost dropped her phone. "Chuck Norris? The famous action movie star? That Chuck Norris?" "Yes," Kelly said. "He walked right into the lobby wearing a denim shirt and boots. Everyone is staring at him. He asked to speak to the person in charge about the nurse who was suspended for helping a veteran. Director Simpson looks like he might pass out." Susan could not believe what she was hearing. "Why would Chuck Norris care about me?" "I don't know, but he seems very serious. He said he heard about you on the news and drove here right away." Susan turned on her TV. On the local news, there was a small crowd of veterans outside Oak Ridge Hospital. William Porter was speaking to a reporter, telling everyone how Susan had been suspended for bringing food to a starving veteran. "This is the thanks she gets for 15 years of service," William said angrily. "They throw her out for showing kindness. Is this how we treat people who care for our heroes?" The reporter turned to the camera. This story has spread quickly on social media, with thousands sharing their support for Nurse Susan Miller. And now, we're getting reports that Chuck Norris himself has arrived at the hospital to speak with administrators. Susan sat down hard on her couch. This could not be happening. She was just a nurse who brought soup to a hungry man. Now she was on the news and Chuck Norris was fighting for her. It felt like a dream. Her phone rang again. This time it was George Simpson, the hospital director. "Nurse Miller," he said, his voice shaking a little. "Your presence is requested. At the hospital tomorrow morning at 9. There will be a special meeting about your situation." "What kind of meeting?" Susan asked. "Mr. Norris has asked to speak with you and the board of directors. He is very interested in your case." Susan did not sleep well that night. She kept thinking about Frank and her other patients. She worried about the meeting. Would she lose her job for good? Why was Chuck Norris involved? None of it made sense. The next morning, Susan put on her best dress and drove to the hospital. The parking lot was full of news vans and people with cameras. A security guard met her at a side door and led her to the large meeting room on the first floor. Inside the hospital, 7 board members sat at a long table. Director Simpson was at one end looking nervous. Chuck Norris sat across from them, calm and serious in a neat suit. When Susan walked in, he stood up and offered her the chair next to him. "Nurse Miller," he said with a nod. "Thank you for coming." Susan sat down, her hands shaking a little. "I don't understand why you're here, Mr. Norris." Chuck Norris smiled slightly. "My uncle was a Vietnam veteran. He died last year. The nurses who cared for him at the end showed the same kind of heart. You did. When I heard about what happened to you, I knew I had to help." The head of the board, an older woman named Diane Lewis, called the meeting to order. "We are here to discuss the suspension of Nurse Susan Miller for bringing unauthorized food to a patient." Chuck Norris spoke before anyone else could. Before we start, I'd like to bring in someone who has something important to say. The door opened, and Frank Winters was wheeled in by a nurse. He looked better than he had in weeks. He wore a clean shirt and his hair was combed neatly. "This is the veteran Nurse Miller helped," Chuck said. "I think we should hear from him." Frank cleared his throat. He looked at Susan, then at the board members. "I fought for this country in Vietnam. I saw things no person should see. When I came to this hospital, I had given up. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to live." The room was very quiet. Even the reporters who had been allowed in stopped writing to listen. Nurse Miller noticed I wasn't eating. She didn't just write it down and walk away. She asked why. She listened. Then she brought me soup that tasted like the soup my mother used to make. Frank's eyes filled with tears. "That soup gave me a reason to eat, to live another day. If that's against the rules, then maybe the rules are wrong." Diane Lewis looked at her fellow board members. Then she looked at Director Simpson. "George, is this true?" The nurse was suspended for bringing soup to a veteran who refused to eat hospital food. Director Simpson shifted in his chair. "Yes, but rules are rules. Outside food could be dangerous. We have policies." Chuck Norris cut him off. "Sometimes, doing the right thing means knowing when rules need to be broken. My uncle's nurses broke small rules to give him dignity in his final days. I think we need to ask what these rules are for. Are they to protect patients or to protect the hospital from being sued?" The room fell silent again. Susan looked at Frank, who gave her a small nod. Diane Lewis spoke after a long moment. "Nurse Miller, your record shows 15 years of excellent service, not one complaint, only praise from patients and fellow staff. Is this the first time you've brought food from outside?" "Yes," Susan said. "I only did it because Frank had not eaten in 3 days. I was worried about him." "And did you check if he had any food allergies first?" "Yes, I checked his chart. The soup had nothing he was allergic to." Diane nodded slowly. "I think we need to look at our policies again. Rules that prevent good care are not good rules." She turned to the rest of the board. "I move that we end Nurse Miller's suspension immediately and pay her for the days she missed." 6 of the 7 board members raised their hands in agreement. Only Director Simpson kept his hand down. "Motion passed," Diane said. "Nurse Miller, you can return to work tomorrow, and we will be reviewing our food policies to allow more flexibility when patients need it." The reporters started writing quickly. Camera flashes lit up the room. Chuck Norris stood and shook Susan's hand. "Thank you," Susan said, still not quite believing what had happened. "Don't thank me," Chuck said. "You're the real hero here. I just opened the door. You were the one. Brave enough to do what was right even when it was hard." Frank reached out and took Susan's hand. "Thank you for the soup," he said quietly, "and for caring when no one else did." As Susan left the meeting room, the other nurses were waiting. They surrounded her with hugs and smiles. William Porter and several other veterans gave her a standing ovation from their wheelchairs. But this was just the beginning of the changes at Oak Ridge Veterans Hospital. No one knew yet how much more Chuck Norris planned to do. Susan returned to work the next day. When she walked through the hospital doors wearing her blue uniform, everyone stopped to look. Some people clapped. Others just smiled and nodded. Susan felt both happy and shy about all the attention. "Let's get back to work," she said to the other nurses. "Our patients need us." But things at Oak Ridge Veterans Hospital were already changing. Director Simpson was not at his desk that morning. Instead, Diane Lewis from the board was meeting with the hospital staff in the big conference room. "After yesterday's events," Diane said, "we have decided to take a fresh look at all our rules. We want to keep our patients safe, but we also want to treat them with respect and kindness. To help us do this, we have asked Chuck Norris to stay on as a special advisor." The room buzzed with surprise. Chuck Norris stepped forward, looking serious and strong. "I'm not a doctor or a nurse," he said in his deep voice, "but I know about fighting for what's right. These veterans fought for our country. Now we need to fight for them. That means looking at each person as a human being, not just a patient in a bed." After the meeting, Chuck walked with Susan to visit Frank Winters. Frank was sitting in a chair by the window looking out at the trees. He seemed stronger already. "Mr. Winters," Chuck said, "I was hoping you could help us with something." Frank looked up with surprise. "Me? How could I help?" "We want to form a veterans advisory group," Chuck explained. "A team of veterans who can tell us what would make life better here at the hospital. Would you be willing to be part of that?" Frank sat up straighter. "I haven't been asked for my opinion in a long time. Yes, I'll do it." Susan felt a warm feeling in her chest. She had never seen Frank look so alive. Over the next few days, more changes came to Oak Ridge. The hospital kitchen started offering comfort food options that reminded veterans of home cooking. Family members could bring in special food items after a simple check by the nursing staff. Visiting hours became more flexible, but the biggest change was yet to come. 1 week after Susan's return to work, Chuck Norris called a special meeting with all staff and many of the veterans who could attend. "I've been talking with the hospital board," Chuck said, "and with some friends of mine who care about veterans. We've decided to start something new here at Oak Ridge. We're calling it the Compassionate Care Program." He pointed to a large screen where the words, "Rules with Heart," appeared. "This program will train all staff to know when being kind is more important than following every rule exactly. It will give nurses like Susan the power to make small changes to help their patients without fear of being punished." The room was very quiet. Even the veterans who usually made jokes were listening closely. "But that's not all," Chuck continued. "My foundation is giving $1 million to Oak Ridge Hospital to create better spaces for veterans and their families, places that feel like home, not like a hospital." Everyone gasped. $1 million was a huge amount of money. Susan could not believe what she was hearing. "And one more thing," Chuck said, looking directly at Susan. "We need someone to lead this program, someone who already knows how to put patients first. Nurse Susan Miller, will you take this job?" Susan felt her heart beat faster. "Me? But I'm just a floor nurse." "You're the person who started all this," Chuck said, "by bringing soup to a veteran who needed help. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can start the biggest changes." Susan looked around the room. The other nurses were nodding. The veterans were smiling. Even Director Simpson, who stood in the back of the room, gave her a small nod. "Yes," Susan said, "I'll do it." Everyone clapped and cheered. Frank Winters wheeled himself over to Susan and took her hand. "You see what you did?" he said. "Your soup did more than feed me. It's going to change things for all of us." The next few weeks were very busy. Susan still worked with her patients, but she also spent time planning the new program. She met with veterans to hear their ideas. She talked with nurses and doctors about rules that got in the way of good care. Chuck Norris stayed at Oak Ridge for 3 weeks. He visited veterans every day, listening to their war stories and telling his own stories about making movies. He ate in the cafeteria with the staff and made everyone laugh with his jokes. He never acted like a famous movie star. He acted like a friend. One day, Susan found Chuck sitting with Frank in the garden behind the hospital. They were looking at old photos. "My nephew was in the same unit," Chuck was saying. "He might have known some of these men." Frank nodded. "War creates a special bond. We become family." Susan watched them for a moment. 2 months ago, Frank hardly spoke to anyone. Now he was sharing his memories with Chuck Norris. It seemed like a miracle. That evening, news vans arrived at the hospital again. A reporter wanted to interview Susan about the changes at Oak Ridge. At first, Susan did not want to be on TV, but Chuck convinced her. "People need to hear your story," he said. "It might inspire other hospitals to make changes too." So Susan sat in front of the camera, feeling nervous but trying to look calm. "Nurse Miller," the reporter said, "you've gone from being suspended to leading a new program in just a few weeks. How does that feel?" Susan thought for a moment. "It feels like proof that one person can make a difference. I just wanted to help a hungry veteran. I never expected all this to happen. And what would you say to other nurses who see rules that need to be changed?" "I would say, speak up, be brave, do what you know is right for your patients, and know that there are people out there who will stand with you." Even people you'd never expect, like Chuck Norris. The reporter smiled. Speaking of Chuck Norris, he's become quite involved here. What's next for the Compassionate Care program? Susan took a deep breath. This was the moment to share their biggest plan yet. We're just getting started, she said. Chuck Norris has a much bigger vision for helping veterans. And tomorrow we're making an announcement that will change everything. The next morning, news trucks lined the street outside Oak Ridge Veterans Hospital. Reporters set up cameras on the front lawn. Important people from the city and state government arrived in black cars. Everyone wanted to hear the big announcement. Susan stood beside Chuck Norris on a small stage set up near the hospital entrance. Her hands were shaking a little, but she tried to look calm. Frank Winters and the other members of the new Veterans Advisory Group sat in the front row, looking proud in their military caps and pins. At exactly 10 o'clock, Chuck stepped up to the microphone. "Good morning," he said. "1 month ago I came to this hospital because I heard about a nurse who was suspended for bringing soup to a veteran. What I found here was both troubling and inspiring. I saw rules that got in the way of good care, but I also saw people like Nurse Susan Miller who were brave enough to do what was right anyway." The crowd nodded and murmured in agreement. "Today, I'm proud to announce that what started here at Oak Ridge will now spread across the country. My foundation is launching the National Compassionate Care Initiative for veterans. We will work with 100 hospitals that treat veterans to help them create better rules, better spaces, and better care." People started clapping, but Chuck held up his hand to show he wasn't finished. "Each hospital will receive funding to create their own compassionate care program, based on what we've started here. And the person who will lead this national effort is someone who knows firsthand what it means to put caring above rules." He turned to Susan with a smile. "Nurse Susan Miller has agreed to become the national director of our initiative. She will travel to hospitals around the country, sharing what she's learned and helping others make the same positive changes we've seen here." The crowd cheered loudly. Susan felt her face turn red. She had only learned about this new job the night before, when Chuck asked her to take it. It was a big step from being a floor nurse, but she knew it was the right thing to do. Chuck handed her the microphone. Susan took a deep breath. "Thank you," she said. "When I brought soup to Frank Winters, I just wanted to help one person. I never imagined it would lead to all this. But now I see that sometimes a small act of kindness can start something much bigger." She looked at the veterans in the front row. "These men and women gave everything for our country. They deserve care that sees them as whole people, not just patients. I'm honored to help make that happen across the nation." After the announcement, there were many questions from reporters. Would Susan keep working at Oak Ridge? Who would take over the local program? How would the 100 hospitals be chosen? While Chuck answered the questions, Susan noticed Frank wheeling himself away from the crowd. She followed him to the quiet garden behind the hospital. "Are you okay, Frank?" she asked. Frank looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "I never thought I mattered anymore. After the war, I felt forgotten, invisible. Now look what's happened, because someone finally saw me." Susan sat on a bench next to his wheelchair. "You always mattered, Frank. I just helped remind you of that. You're going to help a lot of veterans now," Frank said. "But we'll miss you here," Susan smiled. "I'll be back often. This is still my home hospital. And you know what? There's something I haven't told anyone yet. I've asked if you can travel with me sometimes to speak to other veterans. Would you like that?" Frank's eyes widened. "Me? Travel and speak to people?" "Yes. Your story is powerful. It can help others understand why this work matters." For the first time since Susan had known him, Frank Winters smiled a big, full smile. "I'd be proud to do that." The next few weeks were very busy. Susan had to learn about her new job. She met with people from Chuck's foundation to plan how they would choose the 100 hospitals. She helped pick Linda Brown, another longtime nurse at Oak Ridge, to lead the local program. Chuck Norris returned to his home in Texas, but he called often to check on the progress. He also sent famous friends to visit Oak Ridge and meet with the veterans. Movie stars, sports players, and musicians came to shake hands and listen to stories. The veterans walked taller and smiled more each day. One evening, as Susan was packing up her office, Director Simpson knocked on her door. He looked different now, less stiff. His tie wasn't so tight. "Nurse Miller," he said, "I want to say something. Before you leave for your new position." Susan waited. She had barely spoken to Simpson since the day of her suspension. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I cared more about rules than people. You taught me an important lesson." Susan was surprised. "Thank you for saying that." "The board has asked me to step down as director," Simpson continued. "They're right to do so. This hospital needs someone who understands what you and Chuck Norris have started here." Susan didn't know what to say. She had never wished for Simpson to lose his job. "What will you do now?" she asked. "I'm going to work at a small clinic in my hometown. Start over. Try to remember why I became a doctor in the first place." He held out his hand. "No hard feelings?" Susan shook his hand. "No hard feelings." After Simpson left, Susan finished packing her things. Her first trip would be to a veterans hospital in Chicago. Frank would join her there next week. They would share their story and help the staff see how small changes could make big differences for veterans. As she walked down the hall one last time as a regular nurse, Susan stopped by room 312. A new patient was there now, the old Vietnam veteran who had lived there was now traveling around the country, speaking to people, helping other veterans. Susan smiled to herself. Sometimes the smallest things, like a bowl of soup, could change everything. She thought about all the nurses and all the hospitals she would visit. Who knew what changes they might start? Who knew how many lives they might touch? And it all began because she chose kindness over rules. 1 year passed. Susan stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., looking out at a sea of faces. In the front row sat Chuck Norris, smiling proudly. Next to him was Frank Winters, no longer in a wheelchair but using a cane to walk. Behind them were nurses, doctors, and hospital directors from all 100 hospitals that had joined the National Compassionate Care Initiative. "When I look at what we've done together in just 1 year," Susan said into the microphone, "I can hardly believe it. 50,000 veterans have received better care because of changes we've made. Hospital stays are shorter. Recovery times are faster. And most importantly, veterans tell us they feel seen and heard in ways they never did before." The crowd clapped loudly. A large screen behind Susan showed pictures from hospitals across the country. Veterans gardening in new outdoor spaces. Nurses sharing meals with patients. Families staying overnight in comfortable rooms instead of sleeping in chairs. "We've learned that sometimes the best medicine isn't medicine at all," Susan continued. "It's treating each person with dignity and respect. It's remembering that rules exist to help people, not to replace human kindness." When the speech ended, many people came up to thank Susan. Some were crying as they told her how the program had helped their father or mother or brother who had served in the military. Susan felt both happy and humble. She had only done what seemed right at the time. Later, that evening, there was a special dinner to celebrate the first year of the initiative. Susan sat at a table with Chuck Norris, Frank Winters, and several government officials who worked on veterans affairs. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Frank said as they ate. "That bowl of soup. If Susan hadn't brought me that soup, none of this would have happened." Chuck nodded. "Small acts of courage can change the world. I've seen it happen many times." A woman from the government leaned forward. "The president has been watching your program closely, Ms. Miller. He's very impressed with the results. In fact, he wants to talk about making some of your methods standard practice in all government-run veterans hospitals." Susan almost dropped her fork. "The president wants my advice?" "Yes. He's invited you, Mr. Norris and Mr. Winters, to the White House next month." Susan couldn't speak. Frank reached over and patted her hand. "Not bad for a nurse who got suspended," he said with a smile. After dinner, Susan stepped outside for some fresh air. The night was cool and clear, with stars shining above the city. Chuck Norris joined her. "You've done amazing work this year, Susan," he said. "You've changed so many lives." "We did it together," Susan replied. "I couldn't have done any of this without your help." Chuck shook his head. "I just provided resources and opened some doors. You're the one who showed everyone what real caring Looks like you're the hero in this story. Susan smiled. I never wanted to be a hero. I just wanted to be a good nurse. The best heroes never set out to be heroes, Chuck said. They just do what's right when it's needed. The next morning, Susan and Frank flew to their next hospital visit in Seattle. In the airport, people recognized them from news stories and asked for pictures. Frank, once so quiet and sad, now spoke, easily with strangers, telling them about the initiative and how it was helping veterans. On the plane, Susan looked through photos on her phone. She found one from the very beginning, taken the day after she returned to work at Oak Ridge. She showed it to Frank. Look how far we've come, she said. Frank nodded. I was still in a wheelchair then, still afraid to talk much, still stuck in the past. And now? Susan asked. Now I feel like I have a purpose again, helping other veterans heal, showing hospitals how to do better. Frank looked out the window at the clouds below. For 30 years after Vietnam, I was just waiting to die. Now I'm living again. When they arrived in Seattle, the hospital staff greeted them with excitement. The director, a woman named Carol Davis, gave them a tour of the changes they had made based on the Compassionate Care program. Our veterans love the new garden space, or Carol said, and the kitchen now makes food from recipes that the veterans themselves provided. We've had men who wouldn't eat for days suddenly cleaning their plates. Susan smiled, remembering where it all began. They visited the veterans in their rooms. In one room, an old man sat by the window, looking out at the rain. His nameplate said Joe Green, Navy, Vietnam. Hello, Mr. Green, Susan said. I'm Susan Miller, and this is Frank Winters. We're here to talk about the new programs at the hospital. Joe didn't look at them. Don't care about programs, just want to go home. Frank stepped forward. I was in Vietnam too. What unit? For the first time, Joe turned from the window. River, patrol, Mekong Delta. I was Army near Cambodia, Frank said. Tough times. Joe nodded slowly. Nobody understands what it was like. I do, Frank said, and that's why we're here. To make sure the people taking care of you understand too. By the end of the visit, Joe was talking more. He even smiled once. Susan watched Frank working his magic, bringing another veteran back, from the edge of giving up. Later that night in her hotel room, Susan's phone rang. It was Chuck Norris. Susan, turn on the news, he said. Any channel. Susan turned on the TV. There was a story about a new law being proposed in Congress. It was called the Compassionate Veterans Care Act. It would provide money for all veterans, hospitals to adopt the methods that Susan and Chuck had developed. They're calling it the soup law, Chuck said with a laugh, because it all started with a nurse bringing soup to a hungry veteran. Susan sat on the edge of the bed watching as pictures of her and Frank in Oak Ridge Hospital flashed on the screen. A simple act of kindness had grown into something that would help veterans across the entire country. The next day, when Susan and Frank visited the Seattle hospital again, the staff had a surprise for them. In the cafeteria, they had created a special dish called Susan's Soup. The recipe card said, "Sometimes the simplest act of kindness can change everything." Frank tried the soup and smiled. "Almost as good as yours," he told Susan. Susan looked around at the veterans eating in the cafeteria, at the nurses talking and laughing with them, at the pictures of home on the walls and the comfortable chairs where family members could sit. "This is what it was all about," she said softly, "making sure people are treated like people, not just patients." And it had all started because she decided that kindness was more important than rules.